found gasping for air near a bus stop, just a piece of junky debris swept aside by the city. That was the brutal finale of Bridgette Andersen, the shining star of the 80s. But the overdose didn't just kill her once. Her own mother slowly tortured her for 20 years, turning her own flesh and blood into a financial hostage to feed a bottomless greed. Behind the blockbuster fame and the angelic eyes was a lonely child, robbed of her soul long before she was robbed of her life. The brighter the camera flashed, the darker the hell she was forced to call home. Bridgette Andersen was never truly a child. From the moment she could walk, she was an employee. Born in Inglewood, California in 1975, she entered a family dynamic that was already skewed toward exploitation. Her mother, Teresa Andersen, was not the typical Hollywood stage mother caricature who vicariously chases fame through her offspring. Teresa was far more pragmatic and far more dangerous. She was a woman who viewed motherhood as a business opportunity. In Los Angeles, beauty is a currency, and Teresa realized very early that her daughter had a surplus of it. Bridgette possessed a specific type of commercial appeal, a precocious, wide-eyed vulnerability that advertisers kill for. Most mothers see a baby and see a life to be nurtured. Teresa saw a baby and saw a solution to her financial problems. The mechanism of exploitation was simple. The family needed money. Bridgette was cute. Therefore, Bridgette would work. But Bridgette was not just a cute prop. She was a terrified anomaly, a precocious genius trapped in a toddler's body. The warning signs of her tragic intellect appeared early. At just 2 years old, an age when most children are struggling to stack blocks, Bridgette was sitting in restaurants, picking up the menu, and reading it aloud to her stunned parents. She wasn't miming. She was reading complex words with a comprehension that was deeply unsettling. By the time she stepped onto the set of Savannah Smiles at age 6, she had evolved from a prodigy into a machine. She possessed an eidetic memory. She didn't just memorize her own lines. She memorized the entire script. There is a haunting story from the set where this 6-year-old girl actually stopped the production to correct the film's creator, Mark Miller. She took the veteran actor's hand and gently directed him. "Mark, you're saying that wrong. You need to say it with this emotion." It was charming to the crew, but in hindsight, it was a terrifying diagnosis. This wasn't just talent. It was a curse. She was a director's mind trapped in a doll's body, burdened with an intellect that stripped away the comforting illusions of childhood. While other 6-year-olds saw a movie set as a playground, Bridgette saw the strings. She understood the artificiality of the world being constructed around her. She realized with a clarity that no child should possess that the adults weren't playing with her. They were using her. Her high IQ didn't protect her. It made her painfully aware that she was a component in a machine, analyzing human behavior not to make friends, but to survive the payroll. This created a psychological inversion that would doom Bridgette before she even hit puberty. In a functional family, parents provide security for the child. In the Andersen household, the child provided security for the parents. Bridgette was the landlord. She was the breadwinner. She was the reason the lights stayed on. Even at 3 or 4 years old, a child senses this pressure. They understand that their performance is linked to their survival. Bridgette learned to read the room not for social cues, but for employment opportunities. She developed a hypersensitivity to what adults wanted from her. She became a mirror, reflecting back whatever emotion the casting director needed to see. This is not talent. It is a trauma response. It is a survival mechanism honed by a child who realizes that her mother's mood depends entirely on whether or not she books the job. The industry loved her. Of course they did. She was professional. She didn't throw tantrums. She was a tiny adult in a child's body, trained to endure the grueling, repetitive nature of film production without complaint. By the time she was 5, she had a resume that would rival actors 3 times her age. She was the face of Pepsi. She was the face of major retail brands. She was everywhere. But behind the scenes, the machinery was grinding her down. An audition is a rejection simulation. Walking into an audition room meant being judged solely on physical appearance, followed by the inevitable no. For an adult, this rejection is hard. For a child, it is devastating. It chips away at the self-worth until there is nothing left but the need for validation. Teresa did not shield Bridgette from this. She drove her right into the center of it day after day. When Bridgette failed to get a part, the atmosphere in the car ride home wasn't one of comfort. It was cold. It was the silence of a manager disappointed in an underperforming asset. By 1980, the stakes were getting higher. Commercials pay the bills, but movies buy the house. Teresa set her sights on Hollywood feature films. The pressure on Bridgette ramped up. The auditions became more intense. The competition was fierce. This was the era of the super child star, Drew Barrymore, Henry Thomas, Heather O'Rourke. The market was flooded with talented kids, and to stand out, you had to be special. You had to have that it factor. Bridgette had it. She had an intelligence behind her eyes that registered on film. She had a sadness that gave her depth. It was that sadness, ironically, that made her a star. The industry exploits joy, but it feasts on melancholy. A child who looks like they have seen too much is cinematic gold. Bridgette looked like she had seen too much because she had. She was carrying the financial weight of grown adults on her back. The breakthrough and the beginning of the end came with the script for Savannah Smiles. The project was an independent film, a passion project for writer-producer Mark Miller. The premise was sugary sweet. A young girl, feeling neglected by her politician father and socialite mother, runs away and ends up charming 2 bumbling convicts. It was a modern retelling of O. Henry's The Ransom of Red Chief, but stripped of the irony and loaded with sentimentality. They needed a girl who could carry the entire film. She had to be adorable, but she also had to be articulate. She had to make the audience believe that 2 hardened criminals would risk jail time just to hang out with her. They auditioned hundreds of girls. Then Bridgette walked in. The role became a cruel prophecy, a case of life imitating art in the darkest way possible. In Savannah Smiles, the character runs away because her wealthy parents are too busy with their political ambitions to pay attention to her. She runs away to be seen. But in reality, Bridgette's situation was the grotesque inverse. She couldn't run away because she was the only thing keeping the family afloat. In the film, she was neglected emotionally. In reality, she was exploited financially. Her parents weren't too busy for her. They were entirely dependent on her. She was trapped in a house where maternal love was conditional, measured strictly by the residual checks in the mailbox. When she smiled on camera, begging for love, she wasn't acting. She was surviving. Filming Savannah Smiles should have been the highlight of Bridgette's life. On set, she was the center of attention. The crew adored her. Her co-stars treated her with respect. For a few weeks, she was allowed to play pretend in a safe environment. But even on location, the shadow of Teresa loomed large. Teresa was always there, watching, calculating. She wasn't just a chaperone, she was the gatekeeper. She ensured that Bridgette was on at all times. There was no downtime. If Bridgette wasn't filming, she was rehearsing. If she wasn't rehearsing, she was doing press. The line between the character Savannah and the girl Bridgette began to blur. The world fell in love with Savannah. They loved her innocence. They loved her lisp. They loved the way she seemed to heal the broken adults around her, but nobody looked closely at the eyes. Viewed today through the lens of her tragic fate, the film plays like a horror movie. The audience sees a child desperate to please, performing acts of cuteness with a frantic intensity as if she knows that if she stops being cute for even 1 second, the love will stop. The success of the film in 1982 was massive, but with it came a dangerous label. Hollywood didn't just praise her, they branded her. They called her the new Shirley Temple. That moniker wasn't a compliment. It was a curse. It meant she wasn't allowed to be Bridgette Andersen. She was just a replacement part for a nostalgic icon, a product designed to mimic a memory. She was the new darling of Hollywood, but she was already living in a borrowed shadow. For the Andersen family, this was the peak of the gold rush. The money flowed in. They upgraded their lifestyle. They bought things. They lived as if the fountain would never run dry. Teresa Andersen solidified her position as the matriarch manager. She basked in the reflected glory, taking credit for Bridgette's success. She gave interviews where she talked about Bridgette's natural gift and her own sacrifices to help her daughter achieve her dreams. It was a masterclass in gaslighting. The reality was that Bridgette was working adult hours, dealing with adult pressures, and navigating an adult industry, all to support a mother who refused to get a job. The tragedy of the child star is not that they become famous, it is that they become products. A product has a function. A toaster toasts bread, a car drives. A child star generates revenue through cuteness. But products have a shelf life. They wear out. Or, in the case of a child, they grow up. The biological imperative of growth is the enemy of the stage mother. Every inch Bridgette grew was a threat to the business model. Every tooth she lost, every change in her face was a depreciation of the asset. Teresa watched Bridgette's development not with maternal pride, but with managerial panic. She needed Bridgette to stay small. She needed her to stay Savannah. Following the success of Savannah Smiles, the workload became inhuman. The volume of labor this child performed would have crushed a union worker. She wasn't just doing commercials, she was carrying entire productions. She starred in King's Crossing. She worked on Washington Mistress. She held her own against legends in The Golden Girls and Gunsmoke, Return to Dodge. She was working constantly. She was the primary earner, the CEO of Andersen Incorporated at the age of 8, grinding through scripts while other kids were learning to ride bikes. But the cracks were already forming. You can't force a child to carry that much weight without structural damage. Bridgette was tired. She was lonely. She didn't have real friends. She had colleagues. She didn't have play dates. She had networking opportunities. Her entire social existence was transactional. She learned that people only wanted to be around her because of who she was on a poster, not who she was inside. Teresa's control tightened as Bridgette's fame grew. She isolated her daughter. She filtered her interactions. She wanted to ensure that no outside influence could disrupt the revenue stream. She instilled a deep paranoia in Bridgette, a belief that the world was dangerous and that only her mother could navigate it. This is a classic cult tactic. Isolate the victim, make them dependent on the abuser for reality, and then exploit them. Bridgette believed that she owed everything to her mother. She believed that it was her duty to work. She felt guilty when she wanted to play. She felt selfish when she wanted to sleep. She was trapped by a debt she didn't owe, fueled by guilt and manufactured obligation. The financial abuse in the Andersen household was absolute. In California, the Coogan law is supposed to protect a portion of a child actor's earnings, setting it aside in a blocked trust until they turn 18. But the law has loopholes, and Teresa knew them all. She framed expenses, she drew salaries, she justified withdrawals as career maintenance. The vast majority of the money Bridgette earned, money that should have set her up for life, was burned on the daily maintenance of the family's lifestyle. They were eating her future, one meal at a time. As the mid-'80s approached, this financial house of cards faced a biological threat: puberty. In Hollywood, there is a specific brutal term for this phase: the awkward age. For Bridgette, this wasn't just a career slump. It was a punishment for the crime of growing up. She was living a life in reverse. She had reached the absolute peak of her career before she could write her own name, and she was effectively retired by the time she entered junior high. The industry looked at her changing face, the loss of that baby fat roundness, not as natural growth, but as a defect in the product. The question that haunted her wasn't, "What will I do next?" but rather, "If I am not the cute little girl from the movie, then who am I?" She had no answer. She had been designed to be an object, and objects do not have second acts. It is the purgatory where careers go to die. By 1986, the round, cherubic face that had sold millions of tickets in Savannah Smiles was lengthening. Bridgette was entering the uncanny valley of casting, too old to play the daughter who needs tucking in, but too young to play the high school cheerleader. This decline coincided with the production of The Parent Trap 2. On paper, it is starring alongside Haley Mills should have been a triumphant return. In reality, it was a television movie, not a theatrical blockbuster. Bridgette delivered her lines professionally, but the camera captured a weariness far beyond her 11 years. She was working with the stress of a middle-aged accountant facing bankruptcy. The film's reception was decent, but in the Andersen house, decent wasn't enough. The family was living a reality financed by a blockbuster, but the mortgage didn't care that Bridgette was growing up. The bills didn't stop just because the casting directors wanted a new face. When the calls stopped coming, the dynamic in the house shifted from exploitation to resentment. Teresa Andersen did not view the dry spell as a natural fluctuation in a volatile industry. She viewed it as a personal failure on Bridgette's part. The logic was twisted but absolute. I managed you to stardom, so if you aren't working, it's because you aren't trying hard enough. The car rides to auditions became torture sessions. If Bridgette didn't book a commercial, the silence in the car was deafening, broken only by heavy sighs or passive-aggressive comments about how tight money was going to be that month. The psychological weight of that implication was crushing. A 12-year-old girl was made to feel that the family's potential homelessness was her fault because she didn't smile brightly enough for a cereal commercial. Bridgette began to internalize this failure. She looked in the mirror and didn't see a growing girl. She saw a broken machine. She saw the pimples and the changing body as defects. She began to hate her own reflection because it was the source of her mother's unhappiness. This is where the seeds of self-destruction were planted. She learned that her value was entirely external. If the world didn't want her face, then she, as a person, was worthless. To make matters worse, Teresa refused to let Bridgette pivot. A sensible parent might have said, "Okay, the acting is slowing down. Let's focus on school. Let's have a normal childhood for a while." But Teresa was addicted to the lifestyle and the identity of being a star's mom. She pushed Bridgette harder. She sent her to cattle calls for roles she was clearly unsuited for. She made Bridgette dress younger than she was, forcing her into frilly dresses and pigtails that looked ridiculous on a developing preteen. This forced infantilization was humiliating. Bridgette would walk into audition rooms filled with girls her age wearing cool modern clothes while she looked like a relic from 1982. The casting directors would stare. The other mothers would whisper. Bridgette would stand there, burning with shame, performing the act of the little girl, while her body screamed that she was becoming a woman. The rejection became personal. Casting directors in Hollywood are not known for their tact. They discuss children like livestock. Bridgette would hear them talking about her behind the thin walls of the casting offices. She's got a weird look now. She's not cute anymore. Her eyes look dead. She heard it all. She absorbed it all. And then she would go home to a mother who looked at her with the same critical eye. There was no sanctuary. The industry rejected her for growing up, and her mother rejected her for not stopping time. By 1987, Bridgette was largely out of work. The income stream that had sustained the family for 7 years had evaporated. The financial pressure in the household exploded. Arguments were constant. Teresa was frantic, angry, and bitter. She didn't get a job to support the family. She simply demanded that Bridgette fix it. But Bridgette couldn't fix biology. She was trapped in the mundane horror of a suburban financial crisis, exacerbated by the fact that she was the designated savior who had lost her powers. Bridgette was enrolled in public school during the lulls, and this was its own form of hell. School is a cruel ecosystem for any child, but for a fallen child star, it is a gladiator pit. Bridgette didn't enter middle school as an anonymous student. She entered as that girl from the movie. In the beginning, there was curiosity. Then came the jealousy. Then came the mockery. Kids are perceptive. They can smell blood. They realized that Bridgette wasn't rich despite her fame. They saw her wearing the same clothes. They saw the stress on her face. The taunts shifted from, "Can I have your autograph?" to, "I thought you were famous. Why are you eating cafeteria food?" She was isolated. She didn't fit in with the theater kids because she was a professional who had seen the ugly side of the business. She didn't fit in with the popular kids because she was weird, socially stunted from years of working with adults, and carried a heavy, melancholic energy that repelled the carefree vibe of teenage cliques. She was a freak, a museum exhibit. Savannah Smiles became a slur used to torment her in the hallways. She retreated inward. She stopped trying to make friends. She learned that invisibility was safer than visibility. But invisibility was not an option at home. At home, she was under the microscope. Teresa monitored her weight, her skin, her attitude. The mother-daughter bond, which had always been tenuous and transactional, completely severed. Teresa began to treat Bridgette not just as a failed employee, but as a burden. The love, or the performance of love, that had existed when the checks were clearing was replaced by a cold, simmering resentment. Bridgette was now just another mouth to feed, another expense, a reminder of the glory days that were gone. It was during this period, the late 80s, roughly aged 13 and 14, that Bridgette's spirit began to break. She was dealing with the trifecta of adolescent trauma, the loss of identity, the loss of security, and the loss of love. She began to look for an escape. She couldn't run away physically. She had no money, no car, and nowhere to go. So she began to run away mentally. She started hanging out with the burnouts, the kids on the fringe of the social hierarchy who didn't care about movies or money. These were the kids smoking cigarettes behind the bleachers, the ones who cut class, the ones who looked at the world with the same cynical, tired eyes that Bridgette had. For the first time, she found a group that accepted her. They didn't accept her because she was famous. They accepted her because she was broken. They recognized the damage in her. In this group, Bridgette found a new currency: rebellion. If she couldn't be the perfect daughter, she would be the perfect disaster. If she couldn't win her mother's love, she would earn her mother's hatred. At least hatred is an emotion. At least anger is engagement. Indifference was what killed her. She began to experiment with alcohol and marijuana. It wasn't about partying. It was about self-medication. The first time she got high, the knot of anxiety in her chest, the one that had been tightening since she was 2 years old, finally loosened, The voice in her head that told her she was a failure, a disappointment, a has-been, finally shut up. It was the most peace she had felt in a decade. Teresa's reaction to Bridgette's acting out was not concern, it was disgust. She didn't see a crying child, she saw a damaged asset. Every time Bridgette came home smelling of smoke, every time her grades slipped, Teresa saw it as another nail in the coffin of the brand. She screamed at Bridgette, not about her health, but about her reputation. How are you going to get a call back looking like this? You're ruining your chances. Even in the depths of her daughter's crisis, Teresa could only view the situation through the lens of the industry. She was incapable of being a mother. She was a manager until the bitter end, furiously trying to polish a product that was actively disintegrating. By the time Bridgette turned 15, the Savannah Smiles era was officially dead and buried. The adorable little girl was gone, replaced by a sullen, angry, terrified teenager who was trapped in a house with a woman who viewed her as a failed investment. The industry had moved on. They had new darlings now, new victims, to grind through the mill. Bridgette was left with the wreckage. She had no education to fall back on, having missed years of schooling for shoots. She had no money, as it had all been spent. She had no life skills, having been catered to by handlers since toddlerhood. And she had a hole in her soul where her childhood should have been. The stage was set for the final act. The safety net was gone. The predator was in the house. And outside on the streets of Los Angeles, a darker, more lethal solution to her pain was waiting. The slide from teenage rebellion to hardcore addiction is usually a slope. For Bridgette Andersen, it was a cliff. She stood at the edge, looked back at her mother, saw nothing worth staying for, and jumped. The freefall began in the early 1990s. As the decade of grunge and heroin chic dawned, Bridgette Andersen was perfectly positioned to become its casualty. By the age of 16, the marijuana and alcohol that had once served as a buffer against her mother's cruelty were no longer enough. The pain was too deep, the void too wide. She needed something stronger, something that could obliterate not just the anxiety, but the very memory of who she was. She found it in the darker corners of Los Angeles, the city that had once been her playground, filled with studios and sound stages, now revealed its underbelly. She began to frequent the clubs and dive bars of Hollywood, places where former child star was a common and tragic demographic. It was in this ecosystem that she was introduced to harder drugs. Cocaine gave her the manic confidence she had lost. Methamphetamine kept her thin and awake, mimicking the hyper-alert state she had been trained to maintain on set. But it was heroin that truly claimed her. Heroin offers the ultimate escape for the traumatized. It shuts down the pain and turns off the noise. For Bridgette, the high was the only time she felt safe. It was a return to the womb, a place where no one demanded anything from her, where she didn't have to smile, didn't have to perform, didn't have to be Savannah. The needle replaced everything. It was her provider, her comfort, and her only authority. As her addiction took hold, the situation at home in Inglewood devolved into chaos. The money was gone. The bills were piling up. Teresa Andersen, realizing that the golden goose was not just barren but dying, finally played her last card, abandonment. The estrangement that followed was not a mutual decision to drift apart. It was an eviction. Bridgette was pushed out. The narrative Teresa spun to the few relatives or neighbors who asked was that Bridgette was out of control, a wild child, who refused to follow rules. It was a convenient lie that absolved the mother of 20 years of exploitation. In Teresa's mind, she was the victim of an ungrateful daughter. Bridgette found herself on the streets. The image on the movie poster and the reality on the street were now two different worlds. The girl who had charmed America was sleeping on couches in squat houses in Echo Park and Silver Lake. She was living out of a backpack. Her possessions, the few reminders of her past life, were lost or sold. She became part of the invisible population of Los Angeles, the drifters who move like ghosts through the city. Survival became the only script. Bridgette had no resume, no references, and no skills other than acting. But who hires a junkie ex-child star? The industry that had made millions off her likeness now locked its gates. She was a liability. She couldn't get an agent. She couldn't get a reading. The rejection was total. So she turned to the only economy that would accept her, the service industry and the street economy. She eventually found work, but the location offered a cinematic irony too dark for fiction. Bridgette was hired as a cashier at Erewhon, the glittery temple of Los Angeles health culture. The juxtaposition was grotesque. On one side of the counter stood the Hollywood elite, obsessively buying organic kale, macrobiotic salads, and gluten-free bread to extend their lives by another day. On the other side stood Bridgette, pulling down her long sleeves to hide the fresh track marks, her own organs slowly shutting down from the poison flowing through her veins. She was a dying junkie, selling the promise of immortality to the very class of people who had discarded her. She was a ghost hiding in the vitamin aisle, ringing up wellness while carrying death in her pocket. The autograph tragedy became a recurring nightmare during these years. Los Angeles is a small town. People remembered faces. Customers would come to the counter, look at the name tag, Bridgette, and then look at the face. The recognition would dawn slowly. "Wait," they would say, squinting. "You look so familiar. Were you in a movie? Oh my God, you're the little girl from Savannah Smiles." For Bridgette, these moments were not flattering. They were excruciating. They were public autopsies of her failure. She would have to stand there, stripped of her dignity, and confirm that yes, she was that girl. The customers would often be oblivious to the tragedy standing in front of them. They would gush about how much they loved the movie, how cute she was, asking, "What happened? Why aren't you acting anymore?" Every question was a knife twist. Sometimes they would ask for an autograph. Bridgette would sign the back of a receipt or a napkin, her hand shaking from withdrawal or intoxication, giving away a piece of her soul for free. She would watch them leave, knowing they would go home and tell their friends, "Guess who I saw? The Savannah Smiles girl. She looks terrible. She's working at a grocery store." She was a cautionary tale told at dinner parties. The indignity fueled the addiction. To wipe away the shame of the day, she needed more heroin at night. It was a feedback loop of destruction. The money she earned from the store went straight into her veins. When that wasn't enough, she relied on the kindness or the exploitation of men she met in the scene. She fell into relationships that mirrored her relationship with her mother, transactional and abusive. She was used for her name, for her residual fame, or simply for her body. She had been trained to be used, after all. It was the only way she knew how to relate to people. By 1995, Bridgette was 20 years old, but she looked much older. Her health was deteriorating. The years of drug abuse were taking their toll on her organs, her skin, her teeth. She was disappearing. The Bridgette part of her was eroding, leaving only the addict. Yet there were flashes of the old spark. Friends from that era, the real friends, the fellow outcasts, remember her as fiercely intelligent with a dark, biting sense of humor. She was funny. She was kind. She would share her last cigarette or her last dollar. She had a deep well of empathy for broken things, perhaps because she was the most broken of them all. She talked about getting clean. She talked about going back to school. She talked about writing. But talk is cheap on the streets of Echo Park, and heroin is expensive. The relationship with her family was virtually non-existent. Teresa Andersen had washed her hands of the situation. There were no interventions, no trips to rehab paid for by the mother who had spent Bridgette's fortune. When Bridgette did reach out, usually out of desperation for money or a place to crash, she was met with walls. The message was clear. You are on your own. The cruelty of this silence cannot be overstated. A mother knows when her child is dying. Teresa knew, but she chose to protect her own peace of mind rather than fight for her daughter's life. She let Bridgette drift further and further out to sea, refusing to throw a lifeline. In the final year, 1996 leading into 1997, Bridgette's spiral accelerated. She was arrested for drug possession. The mugshot from that arrest is a haunting document. It shows a face ravaged by chemicals, eyes deadened by despair, a ghost of the beauty that had once captivated a nation. It was the anti-headshot. The legal system, like the studio system, chewed her up. She was just another case number, another junkie to be processed. There was no leniency for Savannah. She was put on probation. Fines she couldn't pay were levied, and she was released back into the exact same environment that was killing her. She began to talk about the end, not explicitly perhaps, but in the way she lived. She stopped caring about the future. She lived hour to hour. The pursuit of the high became the only thing that mattered. It was a slow-motion suicide, a deliberate dismantling of the self. She was tired of the struggle, tired of the memories, tired of being the disappointment. May 1997 arrived. The weather in Los Angeles was beautiful, that perfect golden spring that makes the city feel like a paradise. But for Bridgette, the sunshine was mocking. She was living in the shadows. On the days leading up to her death, she was erratic. She was looking to score. She was looking for oblivion. She found herself in the company of people who didn't know her history and didn't care. They were just bodies in a room, sharing a pipe or a needle. It was the ultimate anonymity she had craved. In these circles, she wasn't a star. She was just another customer. The final purchase was made. Heroin, vodka, a classic lethal combination. The speedball's depressed cousin. One shuts down the brain, the other shuts down the body. Together, they are a shutdown command for the soul. Bridgette didn't buy a party. She bought an exit strategy. She walked the streets of Echo Park, carrying her death in a plastic bag. She was 21 years old. She should have been in college. She should have been going to auditions. She should have been dating. Instead, she was looking for a place to lie down and let the noise stop. The official cause of death was an overdose, but the real cause was cowardice. On that fateful day in May 1997, Bridgette didn't simply collapse alone. She was in the company of friends. When she took the lethal combination of opioids and alcohol, her body began to shut down. But the people around her didn't panic for her life. They panicked for their own freedom. They saw a girl turning blue, but they also saw potential drug charges. So they waited. They debated. They hesitated. In the critical minutes where an ambulance could have saved her, they chose to protect themselves from the police rather than save Bridgette from the grave. By the time the call was finally made, the oxygen to her brain had been cut off for too long. She arrived at the hospital not as a patient, but as a body. The drug stopped her heart, but it was the silence of her so-called friends that sealed her doom. As the sun went down and the streetlights flickered on, her body gave up the fight. The respiratory center of her brain, flooded with opioids, simply shut down. It wasn't poetic. It was biological mechanics. The heroin molecules bound to the brainstem, turning off the lights in the house one room at a time. Her lungs stopped expanding. Her heart fluttered and failed. When the ambulance finally arrived, they rushed the Jane Doe to the Queen of Angels Hollywood Presbyterian Hospital. The name was a final irony. She was taken to Queen of Angels Hospital, but there was no salvation waiting for her. She was admitted as an overdose case. Another statistic. The doctors worked on her, intubated her, hooked her up to the machines that beeped and whirred, mimicking the life that had already left. She was stabilized, but she wasn't there. Her brain, starved of oxygen on that sidewalk, had suffered catastrophic damage. She was legally dead. Only the machines were breathing. For days she lay in that hospital bed, a silent, tragic figure in a sterile room. And then the news reached the family. The phone rang in the Andersen house. The prodigal daughter had been found. Teresa Andersen walked into the ICU to see the broken body of the child she had created and destroyed. The reunion was silent. Did she feel guilt? Did she feel sorrow? Or did she feel the familiar panic of managing a crisis? The reunion that Bridgette had longed for in The Parent Trap 2, the healing, the reconciliation, was playing out in the most grotesque way possible. There was no dialogue. There was no hug. There was only the hum of the ventilator and the silence of a mother looking at the wreckage of her own ambition. The doctors delivered the verdict. Brain dead. There was no coming back. The decision had to be made to withdraw life support. Teresa signed the papers. It was the final contract she would sign for Bridgette. On May 18th, 1997, the switch was flipped. The machine stopped. The chest stopped rising. The room went silent. Bridgette Andersen was officially gone. But the horror wasn't over. The credits hadn't rolled yet. There was one last scene to be played, one final act of exploitation that would turn this tragedy into a farce. The funeral. The 4-hour flight from Los Angeles to Illinois carried her over the same flyover states that had once bought her dolls and watched her movies. But this time, she wasn't a passenger. She was cargo stored in the dark hold of the plane. She was returning to Zion, Illinois, a town name that promises a biblical sanctuary but offered only a final cold plot of dirt. It was a place where she had family ties, but it wasn't home. Home was the sound stage. Home was the casting office. Home was the squat in Echo Park. Bringing her here was the first act of the rewrite. It was a geographical cleansing, removing the junkie from the context of her addiction and placing her in the setting of a wholesome Midwestern tragedy. It was easier to bury a beloved daughter in Illinois than to bury a failed child star in Hollywood. Teresa Andersen was waiting in Zion. The transformation was remarkable. The woman who had closed her door to her daughter, who had refused to pay for rehab, who had let Bridgette rot on the streets of Los Angeles, had now assumed the mantle of the Mater Dolorosa, the grieving mother. It is a powerful role, perhaps the most unimpeachable role in society. No one questions the tears of a mother burying her child. It is a social taboo to scrutinize the grief of the bereaved. Teresa knew this. She wrapped herself in black and prepared to direct the final scene of Bridgette's life. The funeral was scheduled at the Congdon Funeral Home. The logistics were handled with a speed that defied the chaotic nature of Bridgette's final years. Invitations were sent. The obituary was written. It was a masterpiece of omission. It spoke of a bright star extinguished too soon. It spoke of talent and beauty. It did not speak of the heroine. It did not speak of the years of estrangement. It did not speak of the fact that the person organizing the service was the architect of the trauma that caused the death. It was a sanitized, hallmark version of a grim reality, designed to protect the living, not honor the dead. But there was a variable that Teresa had not accounted for. Bridgette had a family, not the blood relations who had used her, but the chosen family she had found in the gutters of Los Angeles. These were the friends who had shared their food with her, The ones who had held her hair back when she was sick, the ones who had listened to her cry about her mother at 3 a.m. They were the outcasts, the burnouts, the people Teresa Andersen despised. And they were coming to the funeral. They scraped together the money for plane tickets. It was a pilgrimage of rage. They flew from LAX to O'Hare, a group of 20-somethings in thrift store black, carrying the heavy, jagged truth of Bridgette's life with them. They were walking into a lion's den of hypocrisy, and they were not planning to be silent witnesses. The atmosphere inside the funeral home was suffocating. The air was thick with the smell of lilies and floor wax. The casket was open. Inside lay Bridgette. The morticians had done their work. They had filled out the hollows of her cheeks. They had covered the track marks. They had applied makeup to recreate the face of Savannah Smiles. She looked peaceful. She looked fake. She looked like a doll put back in its box after being broken by a careless owner. The room was filled with relatives and family friends, people who hadn't seen Bridgette in years, people who whispered about tragedy and God's plan. Teresa stood at the front, receiving condolences. She was performing. She was weeping into a handkerchief, accepting hugs, nodding as people told her how strong she was. She was the center of gravity. The narrative was firmly in her control. My poor baby. I tried everything. The demons were too strong. Then the doors opened, and the LA contingent arrived. The energy in the room shifted instantly. It was a collision of two worlds. On one side, the respectable, denial-riddled facade of the Andersen family. On the other, the raw, ugly, honest reality of Bridgette's actual life. The friends walked toward the casket. They didn't look at the flowers. They didn't look at the priest. They looked at Teresa. The tension was physical. You could feel the air pressure drop. One of Bridgette's closest friends, a young woman who had lived with her during the worst days in Echo Park, walked up to the casket. She looked down at her friend. She saw the makeup. She saw the lie. Then she looked up at Teresa, who was standing just a few feet away, dabbing her eyes. The confrontation that followed was not scripted. It was visceral, the scream of a generation that had been used and discarded by its elders. The friend didn't whisper, and she didn't observe the decorum of the dead. She walked right up to Teresa, breaking the heavy silence of the Midwest funeral. She didn't offer condolences. She offered an indictment. Screams of accusation echoed off the walls, blaming the mother for the very abuse that had led to this moment. The grieving mask was shattered not by tears, but by the raw, ugly truth of their history. The room froze. Teresa looked up, her performance of the grieving mother interrupted by the raw fury of the truth. But the friend wasn't done. She pointed a trembling finger at the woman in black. She called you. She called you for help, and you hung up on her. Do you remember that? You hung up on your dying daughter. It was a verdict delivered over an open casket. The polite veneer of the funeral didn't just crack. It exploded. Teresa Andersen stood there, her face a mask of indignation. She didn't crumble. She didn't confess. She did what she had always done. She denied. She signaled for the funeral directors. She signaled for security. "Get them out," she hissed. "Get these junkies out of here. They are disrespecting my daughter." The audacity of the statement was breathtaking. Disrespecting. As if the years of exploitation weren't disrespect. As if the neglect wasn't disrespect. As if the open casket photo op wasn't the ultimate disrespect. The friends were removed. They were escorted out of the funeral home into the parking lot. But they had done what they came to do. They had punctured the lie. They had forced the truth into the room, even if only for a moment. Inside, the service continued. The priest, uncomfortable but professional, steered the proceedings back to Scripture. He spoke of forgiveness. He spoke of peace. He spoke of Bridgette finding rest in the arms of the Lord. Teresa composed herself. She went back to weeping. She accepted the flag of sympathy. The relatives, eager to avoid the ugly reality that had just been shouted at them, retreated into their denial. They told themselves that those kids were just drug addicts, that they didn't know the real story. It is amazing what people will believe to avoid looking at the darkness in their own families. They drove to the cemetery. The procession was long. The hearse led the way, a shiny black Cadillac carrying the girl who had died at a bus stop. They lowered her into the ground. Teresa threw the first flower. It was a rose, a symbol of love, or perhaps a final prop. As the dirt hit the casket, the reality of the erasure set in. Bridgette was being buried under 6 feet of Illinois soil, and with her, the Andersen family hoped to bury the evidence. They wanted to bury the child labor. They wanted to bury the financial abuse. They wanted to bury the negligence. They wanted the story to end here. They wanted the world to remember Savannah Smiles and forget the junkie in Echo Park. They wanted the product, not the person. But the grave is not a vault, it is a marker. And the friends outside the gates, the ones who were not allowed to say goodbye, they carried the memory. They went back to the airport. They flew back to Los Angeles. They went back to the streets where Bridgette had actually lived. And they told the story. They told anyone who would listen. The days following the funeral were filled with a deafening silence. The media covered the death, of course. Child star dies of overdose. It was a reliable headline. It sold papers. But the coverage was superficial. They ran the before and after photos. The cute kid versus the mugshot. They tut-tutted about the dangers of Hollywood. They blamed the lifestyle. They blamed the demons. They rarely looked at the mother. They rarely looked at the mechanics of the exploitation. It was easier to blame the victim for taking the drugs than to blame the parent for creating the need for them. Teresa Andersen went back to her life. She retreated into seclusion, shielded by the narrative of the grieving mother. She didn't give interviews. She didn't write a book. She simply faded away, living on whatever was left, or perhaps finding new ways to survive. She escaped justice. There are no laws against being a bad mother. There are no statutes of limitation on emotional abuse. You can destroy a human being from the inside out, and as long as you don't leave a bruise, you can walk away. You can even sit in the front row at the funeral and receive condolences. In the end, the funeral of Bridgette Andersen was the perfect metaphor for her life. It was a production. It was a set. Everyone had their lines. The costumes were perfect. The lighting was somber. But the star of the show was dead, and the director was taking a bow for a tragedy she had written. The dirt settled over the grave. The grass grew. The world moved on to the next Savannah Smiles, the next cute kid with the big eyes, unaware that the grinder was waiting for them too. The grave in Mount Olivet Memorial Park in Zion, Illinois, is unremarkable. It sits in a quiet section of the cemetery, far from the Hollywood hills that consumed her. There is no eternal flame. There are no crowds of fans leaving teddy bears. The grass grows at the same speed it does everywhere else. If you stand there, you don't feel the magic of Hollywood. You just feel the wind coming off Lake Michigan. This is where the physical reality of Bridgette Andersen ended. The biological machine that had been worked to exhaustion, pumped full of chemicals, and discarded by its owners, finally stopped running. But the product, the Bridgette Andersen that Teresa sold to the world, did not die. It is immortal, and that is the cruelest part of the story. The true horror of her fate hides in plain sight, on the shelves of the family section in any blockbuster of the late 90s. The cover art of Savannah Smiles remained bright and cheerful. Inside American living rooms, Families sat on couches, laughing at a 6-year-old girl charming two convicts. They were consuming the product exactly as it was designed, but the audience was watching a ghost. The image on the screen is not a person. It is a capture of light and sound from 1982. The smile you see is frozen in time, preserved in the amber of celluloid. When Bridgette smiles in that movie, she is smiling at a mother standing behind the camera who is calculating the overtime pay. When she cries, she is crying with a technique honed by the fear of rejection. You are not watching a performance. You are watching a documentation of exploitation. Every frame of that film was paid for with a piece of her childhood. The audience becomes a silent partner in the transaction. The market demands the cute kid. It demands the tears. Box office receipts fuel the machine that grinds the child into dust. The masses consume the trauma and call it entertainment. There is a scene in Savannah Smiles where the character talks about just wanting to be loved. Viewed through the lens of the heroine and the bus stop, the film no longer looks like a movie. It looks like a hostage video. The girl on the screen is smiling to survive. She is sending a desperate signal to the future, begging to be seen as a human being, not a prop. The world thought she was a great little actress. The tragedy is that she wasn't acting. This is the Savannah Smiles curse. It is the specific curse of the child star. They are trapped in the moment of their greatest commodification. Bridgette Andersen is allowed to grow up in reality, to get pimples, to get addicted, to die, but in the cultural memory, she is forbidden from aging. She must remain 6 years old forever. She must remain a cute, unthreatening object used by society to project its own innocence. The reality of the 21-year-old junkie dying on the pavement is too ugly, so society edits it out. The public refuses to look at it, preferring the lie, preferring the movie. The industry that killed her learned nothing from her death. Why would it? The business model works. For every Bridgette Andersen who breaks, there are 1,000 other mothers in waiting rooms across Los Angeles, pushing their daughters forward, desperate to take her place. They saw what happened to Bridgette, but they tell themselves, it will be different for us. My daughter is special. I'm not like Teresa. But the machine doesn't care who you are. It only cares about what you can produce. It chewed up Judy Garland. It chewed up Anissa Jones. It chewed up Bridgette Andersen. The corruption of innocence didn't even end with Bridgette. The cultural impact of Savannah Smiles twisted into a dark legacy that reached the very bottom of the industry. Years later, a young woman named Shannon Wilsey, captivated by the innocence of Bridgette's character, chose to adopt the stage name Savannah. But Shannon wasn't a child star. She became one of the most famous figures in the adult film industry. 2 Savannahs. One created to be the symbol of purity, the other adopting that name to perform acts of lust. Both women were chewed up by the machinery of fame. Both women struggled with demons, and both women met violent, self-inflicted ends. It is a haunting footnote in Hollywood history. The name that was meant to represent a smile became synonymous with the complete destruction of the soul, and it kept rolling, feeding on the next generation of Britneys, Lindsays, and Amandas. The names change, but the grinder stays the same. Teresa Andersen lived the rest of her life in the shadow of the narrative she tried to control. She couldn't stop the whispers, but she could ignore them. She kept the money that was left, if there was any. She kept the memories that suited her. But she could never again look at that movie without knowing the price of the ticket. Or perhaps she could. Perhaps the delusion was so complete, the narcissism so absolute, that she watched Savannah Smiles and felt only pride in her creation, completely dissociating from the destruction of the creator. That is the nature of the stage parent. The child is an extension of the self, and if the limb becomes gangrenous, you cut it off to save the body. The friends who were kicked out of the funeral carried the truth with them. They are the keepers of the flame, but not the flame of the movie star. They remember the Bridgette who worked at the health food store. They remember the Bridgette who cracked jokes in the back of a dive bar. They remember the Bridgette who was terrified of the dark. They remember the person, not the product. They know that her life wasn't a tragedy because she lost her fame. It was a tragedy because she never found her freedom. She escaped the studio, but she never escaped the programming. She died believing she was a failure because she stopped making money for her mother. That is the ultimate victory of the abuser. They convince the victim that the abuse is their own fault. Bridgette Andersen's death was not a mystery. It was a math problem. Take a vulnerable child, add a greedy parent, subtract a childhood, multiply by the indifference of Hollywood, and divide by the availability of heroin. The result is always the same. It is a formula as reliable as gravity. The only variable is how long the subject survives before the equation balances out to zero. Bridgette lasted 21 years. In the context of her life, that was an endurance test. When a child star acts precocious and cute on television, the world smiles. But the camera hides the fatigue. It hides the fear. It hides the person cashing the check. Savannah Smiles is not a family comedy. It is a crime scene recorded on film. And the evidence is streaming on Netflix, looping forever. A beautiful, smiling indictment of a system that eats its own young.